The real apartheid is to support and speak at these conferences. Historically black colleges and universities are just more racism and don't accomplish anything. Having your own space is just more racism and sexism and doesn't fix anything. The premise being offered here is very clear. It is a reverse racism perspective shared by my friends and many other people I know and work with, even professionally, that think that by having spaces specifically dedicated for the use of, say, black people gathering together and things like that, that it is just more racism. Of course, this applies to other comments as well, and that, reverse sexism and all those other things that people like to say. And so the contention here is that having these underrepresented minority spaces is just as bad as segregation. For example, Jim Crow or apartheid, as the many people have unfortunately said to me at this point by now, among other things. And of course, right, they want to be very, very clear that what they're trying to say here is that a conference, a social gathering that excludes people based on their skin color is racist, right? Whether they're white or black or any other kind of shade of human skin. So obviously, I don't believe in this idea of positive discrimination, whatever that means. And as I offered to do, I said that I would put together evidence and some education about why that doesn't work. So the idea of these solutions that my friends and many others are trying to peddle to me is that I need to attend the old spaces or replicate them and then attempt to improve on either their formula or what they've done. Or I just need to educate them, right? Educate them at some point in their lives or whatever else in order to successfully combat this kind of sexist racism. And that at no point should I be thinking about making my own spaces, or anyone else should be thinking about making their own spaces. And I should absolutely not be thinking about attending these spaces as well. So let's start with a very, very intrinsic part of this, which is that the current spaces that we have right now do not work. And this is going to be a proof by contradiction, right? So the criteria that we have set out here for any space is that it has adequate content and it is accessible to beginners, and some kind of friendly, right? To whether it's to beginners or experts, anyone on the spectrum, right? As long as you're catering to your target audience, right? That's the goal, right? So to contradict that, right, we have to prove one of those previous statements false. So either the space has inadequate content for your target audience, or it is inaccessible to beginners, or it is hostile, right? So we need to prove one of these statements false. Now, obviously, we can't prove the first statement false because, how could you possibly say that, right? I mean, the amount of resources available to both beginners and experts in the C++ community, in the C communities, and various other places is vast. So I guess that only leaves hostility as a thing that we need to think about. So is there hostility, right? And the way you figure this out, the way you prove this hostility is you would have to find out a trackable, recordable, repeatable issue, or you'd have to find leadership that kind of fosters an in-group or has egregious breaches, of the social contract, right, of basic human dignity. Um, so we need to figure out a way to measure that hostility. Now, what we can do is we can start with a proxy for hostility, for maybe hostility, right, by measuring participation, right? Participation is a pretty good way to find out if there might be some hostility somewhere. Now, of course, that's not always true, right? Some people just don't want to participate because they don't care for it, because it's not catered to them, because, the space is just not what they're looking for, right? So you can't just say that lack of participation is, hostility. You need to actually go check the hypotheses and look at the data and see whether or not that is actually the case. So we're going to use women in computer science, right? We're going to start with women in computer science because information on other kinds of underrepresented minorities in computer science is substantially underdeveloped. Of course, for women, there's about 40 plus years of this data. So we're going to look at that and try to detect, is there some kind of hostility that is keeping them out, or is it just kind of some lack of interest? So we're going to look at a lot of different data. Statistics, obviously, from the real world. We're going to look at psychology and neuroscience and other, informatics and cross disciplined papers that are published in various different journals, whether they're longitudinal studies or case studies or qualitative reports or quantitative articles. And we're also going to look at, we're going to pull a lot of our data from the U.S. Census Bureau, the Open Economic Cooperation and Development place. We're going to also pull data from Eurostat. We'll look at the Australian government's publicly available data, the Ministry of Education in Brazil, Vietnam, and more. All right, so we're going to look at everything we can get our hands on, right? So let's start with the participation, right? So women are essentially 50% of the population, right? Depending on what country you look at, you're looking at 42% to 51%, right? And you're talking millions and millions or hundreds of millions of people, or in some cases, billions of people. The participation in computer science and science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, though, is vastly lower than that, right? So there is a participation difference here, right? 11% if you're in the Czech Republic, or say 30% if you're in Bulgaria. And of course, we want to remind people of the law of large numbers here, right? So if you observe a lot of something, a lot of the same thing in some similar-ish category, right? It tends towards the true value of it, right? This is something that people take advantage of in ray tracing and a bunch of other stuff to produce, high fidelity images. So we observe that if women make up about 50% of the population, where's the eventual 50% reflection in large populations in STEM fields, right? So if everything is equal, all things are held equal, and you wanted to take a sampling of any subpopulation, the idea is that if it is an egalitarian or equal place, you would eventually just see kind of a direct reflection of the population of that nation or that culture inside that specific thing, right? So why are there not 50%, or about 50% populations of women in STEM fields, and particularly in computer science? So the hypothesis here is that hostility exists. And of course, this is important to set this up like this because it means that the null hypothesis, which is the default that is always assumed if you can't prove that hostility exists, is that there is no hostility, right? So our hypothesis is that hostility exists, and our null hypothesis is that there is no hostility, and that nothing is wrong. So that means that the burden of proof is on us to prove that there exists hostility, right? That's the way you set up these, statistical experiments and other kinds of experiments, right? Unfortunately, it's incredibly easy to prove this. And I'm not just talking about reports about like surveys and things like that. I'm talking about actual statistically significant qualitative data that has been peer reviewed and multiply reproduced in many different scenarios, right? So women and outsiders have adverse effects for GitHub pull requests, right? Regardless of the quality of the input, right? When you looked at women who face discrimination, people who face discrimination based on gender, at least 1/3 of women face that discrimination based on their gender, right? In open source repositories across the world. Okay, so that's pretty damning that they were able to find within a beyond a shadow of a doubt of statistical significance that this was happening in many cases. But it goes beyond that, right? There are whole country reports and whole domain reports. Like, for example, the European Commission is a branch of the European Union, which means that Europeans pay tax dollars to have these people go out and try to figure out policy support for various different parts of their lives. And in one of those particular documents, I believe D17 and D19, there is a document on free Libra open source software and ways to support it, right? And so as part of this report, they found that women are actively, even if unconsciously, excluded rather than kind of passively disinterested in software, in computer science. And they talk about the effects and the exclusion and the way that they were able to figure that out and how they found that data, right? This was done in 2006, so it was a very old report that's been around for almost, give it a couple months and it'll be 15 years. There's also other studies done at smaller universities and other places that look into specific communities, whether it's Debian or elsewhere, that have found evidence of not only lack of participation, but sometimes unconscious bias and discrimination in these communities, okay? So there's a large body of evidence that kind of proves that this is the case, beyond a statistical reasonable doubt, okay? It's it's also in industry reports, right? So this is, for example, a picture from Kate Gregory's blog at TechEd in 2004. And this picture is essentially a manifestation of the fact that the conference didn't really believe that there were any women that were going to be using the restroom, so of course they would just convert it to a men's restroom. But if Kate Gregory is in attendance, well then, how does one of your featured individuals actually go to the bathroom if you've repurposed all of the women's restrooms to be men's restrooms? Side note, this was actually a popular tactic when done on purpose. TechEd didn't do this on purpose. Obviously, they weren't trying to make Kate's life miserable. But this was actually a popular tactic that has been used, I believe, even into the 21st century, called bathroom leashing or urinary leashing, where they would make it difficult for women to participate in events by essentially making it so that they had to walk ridiculously long ways or go out of their way to find basic amenities to help themselves. So, for example, restrooms, wash closets, etc., etc. So, an accident at Tech Ed, but something that they actually ended up doing anyway. There's also been industry reports more recently about the ways that women need to conduct themselves in order to actually be successful and survive in the technology field, in computer science. This is from Patricia Ashley, who has spent a long time in open source and a long time, of course, in closed source circles as well, putting out this kind of report about the ways that you survive the bigotry that exists in tech and the unconscious and conscious biases that people will deploy against you if you are a woman. And, of course, some of those tips also apply to other underrepresented minorities. Not only that, but we see that this stuff is also replicable across the world, right? Whether you're looking at the United States in higher education institutions, or you're looking at the industry, or you are taking a look at the other places in general, right? Whether it's India or Rwanda, Japan, Brazil, Australia, the evidence for the amount of discrimination and hostility that exists in tech is pretty astoundingly high. So, okay, there does seem to be some, there does from the data and from multinational consensus appear to be a discrimination and a hostility that exists towards women in particular. But it's not just women, it applies to other groups as well. Whether it is Asian Americans, whether it is Asians in general, in, for example, Korea or China or places like Vietnam or Cambodia, there is actually demonstrable, provable, qualitative and quantitative reports composed by whole regions, whole countries, groups of nations, individual nations, and many other places that show, both by the numbers and elsewhere, that we are actually not doing very well on all fronts. And so, obviously, I mean, these are a couple of quotes from some of the articles below, but basically, you know, tech has had a very big problem in being able to not only recruit but retain a diverse body of talent. And it's not even just the reports or even from women themselves, but you can even take it from, you know, Linux Jesus himself. When Torvalds took a break from the Linux kernel development, he said that when he comes back, he's going to put in place a code of conduct and a bunch of other stuff. Now, of course, the whole community exploded when this happened. Of course, with accusations of social justice warriors, among other things, flying out. But as people kept trying to speak over and for Linus, he actually sent an email to the BBC to further clarify his position, some of which I will reproduce here. He said, "I absolutely do not want to be seen as being in the same camp as low-life scum on the internet that think it's okay to be a white nationalist Nazi and have some truly nasty, misogynistic, homophobic, or transphobic behavior. But I do claim that it never ever was any kind of nastiness. I got upset with bad code and people who made excuses for it and used some pretty strong language in the process. Not good behavior, but not the racist, etc. claptrap contract some people spout. So in the end, my "I really don't want to be too PC" stance simply became untenable. Partly because you can definitely find some emails from me that were simply completely unacceptable, and I need to fix it going forward. But to a large degree, also because I don't want to be associated with a lot of people who complain about excessive political correctness. What Linus began to realize is that the rhetoric that he was using of tech above everything, to the point that you can be a jerk, to the point that you swear at everybody and use all caps and whatever else you have, demonstrated that his rhetoric and his ability was essentially allowing people with some very nasty views to show up in not only kernel development, but other open source products that replicated the kind of ideas and thought process that went into trying to create the communities around these places. And so by replicating Linus's behavior, and as Linus himself has realized, it gave an out for those who were truly bigoted and nasty to support themselves by saying, listen, as long as we talk about technology, we can say whatever other additional stuff we want to, no matter how nasty it is, because we're focusing on the technology, right? This is all about the technology. Any other accusation, the other is just me being a little bit too passionate, but it's okay because it's about the technology, right? And if even Linus can realize that, hey, maybe we're being the baddies, you've probably got a lot of problems in your community. But what I really wanted to emphasize is that the data shows that there really isn't like a lack of interest problem, or I'm not interested problem, or I don't have time for this problem. What a lot of the data overwhelmingly shows is that there is a massive amount of interest, especially in young girls, in computer science and in other technical fields. But what happens is over time is that they are excluded and discriminated against and harassed, even if they manage to make it to the point where they actually want to contribute to things like open source. So there is genuinely an anxiety, fear, discrimination, and harassment problem in the industry, right? This is stuff that has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond a shadow of a doubt, in multiple decades of scientific literature and in across multiple different countries. Thankfully, it's not all gloom, right? So educational improvements are happening across the board, and a lot of numbers are increasing in early education. There's a lot of people that spend a lot of time talking about what exactly attracts them to technology, but in cases of, say, like India or a couple other places, what they find is that the reason the numbers are a little bit higher in those places than, say, the U.S. and other countries is because there is an explicit okay that it is fine for women to do computer science. That is an okay field for them. And in fact, this replicates early United States numbers where they also had high participation from women in computer science, because at the time it was seen as work that women were supposed to do. So when they would go to school and they would learn to do, quote, secretarial work, they would also learn computer science because that is what they were expected to do when they left. Unfortunately, despite the number of programs and things that have turned around the educational decline in computer science, what we're actually finding is that this is actually only manifesting in early education. And places that are lagging behind are places like the industry itself. Right, so this is from a study that looked at the role of education. It said the results show that access to education is not a solution in and of itself. It's only one part of what should be a multidimensional policy-making approach. There is no simple solution. And when you begin to dig into that report and you begin to look at other reports that report similar things, you find out that underrepresented minorities are leaving their jobs at 1.5 to 2.5 times the rate of their peers. And not only that, but underrepresented minorities are also not making it to PhD levels of research and similar. In fact, the global research pool is almost 72% male in science, technology, education, and mathematics, and it gets a little bit worse for computer science. So this is a direct rebuttal to essentially what my friends have been trying to tell me during the conversation, that, well, because they're discriminated at early stages, that's why they don't show up at these conferences, right? And that's actually not exactly the case. What we find is that there's also discrimination and hostility at higher levels, right? And that's why you can't just start when they're young and in school, because if you support them up through school and then drop them on their face when they get to the industry or when they start trying to penetrate into master's degree programs and PhD programs, then you're still going to end up with the same problem, no matter how many additional students you're trying to funnel into the industry. And this makes it important, right? Education will never be enough to tackle and solve the problems that are before us, right? This has been reported in multiple different reports all over the globe. You can't just have education. You have to have a cohesive policy-making approach that includes the industry and the workplaces and the various other higher levels and higher echelons of these communities and these industries. We also have pretty strong evidence that the workplace and the industry are toxic, right? So in the US and elsewhere, what we're actually finding is that there's all kinds of different discrimination, and that discrimination is imported even from other countries. So, for example, India actually has imported caste system discrimination into many places in the European Union and into the United States. A study was done by the United Kingdom to help inform whether or not caste system discrimination should be put as part of the Equality Act of the nation. And what they found is that there was actually caste system discrimination that had permeated not only most of the jobs, but even white collar jobs such as technical fields. This also was found to be the case in the United States and in other countries as well. We also found that there was also lots of discrimination against women in various different conferences, right? Most keynote speakers in most technical conferences could report harassment of some kind and discrimination of some kind at these conferences, right? From Black and Indigenous people of color who reported 62% to others who reported a 53%, right? So we also have an initial problem in the growth in the industry, right? And the growth in these conferences and other places that we want to participate in, right? So individual conferences are basically providing the majority of growth for women and Black and Indigenous people of color. So, for example, the TNW conference was basically responsible for 5% of all the growth in the women who are presenting at these conferences since 2017, right? And then literally every other conference combined basically only amounted for 4%, right? And that's because TNW had a specific push to put more women who were technically competent to give presentations and everything else at these various places. So we see that we're actually lacking in growth opportunities for women in the industry and in our workplaces and in the places where we celebrate those people who do work, right? And to get even worse, like system programming conferences are actually doing the worst here. Now, finding out the numbers for this are really difficult because I reached out to a lot of organized and well-known folk and I started asking them questions, and unfortunately 90% of them didn't get back to me, whether it was emails to Hanselman or a bunch of other places. They couldn't really connect me with people who were interested in getting the data. And after a while, I kind of got discouraged in sending out emails and getting back nothing. But there were some people who did get back to me, but unfortunately, the story was basically universal. They weren't collecting that data. So I had almost nothing to go on. So in order to figure out at least a little bit of data that's more relevant to specifically the CS Plus community, I went the old-fashioned way, right? A lot of conferences featured their speakers, give links to bios, and everything else, right? So what I did is I went to every single conference that I knew of, that I had attended or thought of attending, and many more that I probably would never attend, and began to basically go through their speaker pages and everything else to figure out what was the representation like, right? If you want to get into the industry, you need to be able to see yourself in 5-10 years doing things that those other people are doing, right? And much science has proven that you need to be able to see role models, especially role models that look like you, that show you that there is a path, yes, from going to school, but also to exiting into the industry itself, right? So are there those role models, and do we have enough of that representation? In this case, because I'm counting the numbers myself, I can actually get data on other underrepresented minorities, and specifically I'll be focusing on Black statistics, right? I mean, the other statistics are dismal, but, we'll focus on Black statistics. So remember the law of large numbers, right? We want a sufficiently large population pool, conferences basically over their entire lifetime, and what we hope is that the numbers will tend towards true value the more and more of it you observe, right? And so what we're hoping is that in an egalitarian society or an egalitarian conference, you will effectively see that over time it will basically trend towards the percentages of the various places that these conferences are held at. Now, the majority of the conferences I looked at are basically in the European Union, the United States, or claim themselves to be international conferences. So these are some of the percentages of the populations that you would expect to eventually show up in these places for the work that they're doing. Unfortunately, the numbers are vastly disappointing. Whether they are United Kingdom conferences, or whether they're United States, or whether they're in Norway or somewhere else, the numbers are always disappointing, right? And sometimes it's literally just me as a speaker showing up at these places, kind of propping up the numbers on my lonesome. But what we see is that there's really not a lot of representation, at least in recent conferences. Of course, this doesn't get any better when you start looking at even more conferences in various different places, or even try to change the year. Sometimes the numbers drop off and everything else. Now, this isn't exactly the greatest representation, right? Because this is just a single year, right? We want to look at conferences over time. But even for things like Rust conferences, or BuildCon, or Build, or .NET specific conferences, we don't see great representation of Black individuals, right? That meet any of the demographics of anywhere that they're targeting. So what is going on here, right? Now, obviously, some people would object to this because this just looks like quotas, right? Like, are you just saying that we just need to get the percentages up? Like, and no, that's not what I'm saying. I don't want you to just try to artificially inflate percentages or stuff as many people in until you meet some magical number, right? But what I do want to see is overtime improvement, or at least some amount of penetration into the industry and into the conferences that represent those industries showing up, right? So you would think that over time we would improve, right? So for example, for over a 5-year span of CPCon, we basically made almost no movement despite having almost 70 plus new speakers added to the pool. This is also similar for ACCU in that from 2002 to 2019, we basically have seen no growth in diverse individuals showing up to speak at these conferences, right? And these are conferences that claim that hold themselves to international, or at least statewide for the United States, acclaim, right? So, okay, maybe that's just not good enough, right? What about the averages? And in fact, the averages are really terrible, right? If you focus on 2019 and 2020, we do a little And it just makes you wonder, like, is any one of their five senses even working? Is there a firing synapse in their head that could just look around and see a multi-platform wage war against specifically named individuals, reading from their personal blog and quoting from them there to make fun of them? It was a mess, right? And it's detrimental to the community, this community at large, right? Because in 1999, when they actually were focused on the tech, when they actually were focused on the envelope, right? You know, they made progress. But in 2020, and even for the past 3 years, we just kind of had this about what we're supposed to be doing, and a lot of people, you know, have scientific consensus on this issue. Something just in your head just thinking about, have they settle on this as like the truth of the matter? Even though, again, right, there's evidence of people who are afraid to reveal any part of themselves at all. Who have to sit in fear and guard everything about themselves. So this one person, you know, to this day, I've never been able to bring myself to inform employers that I'm doing. Humiliation is just human. It used to be that people think of homosexuality so they wouldn't get fired. Right? We have people who recognize that the system is completely untenable. Of course, in the case of this specific female, this person then goes on to disparage the program that they're talking about because they feel like they're being unfairly treated as a white person. And of course, they talk about how
asking them, and they're like, they're asking, well, who are you and why are you here? So, oh, I'm down to meet, I'm a volunteer helping out. Before I can even finish my sentence, the words that came out of this man's mouth were, oh, so that's why they keep running you back. This is 2019. These are the attendees at our conference. And this is the way that they behave. This is the way they feel comfortable behaving, even in professional settings. Like, even with complete strangers, and even with organizers and other people in that room who did nothing to defend or stop that, while we were all congregated just before the first real day of the conference in the lounge area, this person felt that they could say this, and of course, nobody did anything. Right? No matter how shocked I was, no matter how I tried to explain to them that I'm also giving a talk and all this other stuff, it doesn't matter. Because they have an idea of who you are before we ever get a word in that. But it's also other. So, this is an example of people, right? And this is where this group individual started attacking students. Of course, saying that students who have 2 years of experience with infiltrating C++, and involved with programs and almost meeting and doing horrible things, right? And the implicit assumption that every student on the committee, of course, is not experienced in claiming that the people there don't know C++, that they don't have like 10 years of experience or any kind of experience at all. Generally denigrating in general, but also kind of painting the committee as an infantile, juvenile thought. Of course, even students do this, right? So this is another example of the way that they think and make and other, that they do in other, of the way that they present to other people with this impression within that isn't. And imagine if you're a student and you first showed up, and this is one of the first things you read. So there you show up, you're a student, you're trying to learn. There's many students in teaching like that who have to sit down and kind of process the idea that someone who feels kind to me, or a predator, or smart people go around, and they're being told that they are not that good, that even if they had ideas, they're not welcome. And to know that they need 10 plus years of experience, right? Or, kind of feeling and, even when we took the time to defend it. So I responded, and I clarified that the students that I know of that are on the committee, the very few of them, are amazingly accomplished. Elias Conan implemented basically half a format. Before he finished high school, he was one of format's top contributors. He actually showed up at the C++ Now conference as a volunteer, and that's where he got to share a lot of his story and got to help with the process and get actual things that people are excited about move towards the standard. I talked about myself, who was also a student at the time, and I also talked about other people's doctorate work through academics and the work they did for the committee, right? And these are people, I was lucky enough to be around when Thomas Rogers, who was a Wilson super discipline up there, was reviewing some of the Stuximity stuff, and the praise and the mind-blown awe that a rich state sequence implementer showed at Dr. Prince's ability to handle, acknowledge the deep technical details, but tease out why their design and the performance of their design was valid and well thought out, was breathtaking to see. But yet, we still kind of throw on this idea that, I can't leave the student, and actually just the project of what experience they had. And even when I went on to press this person, to get them to give me examples of things that they thought were running the community and running it into the ground, that individual didn't give me it, right? I asked over and over and over again, and I got no examples. I got no name. I didn't even get a single proposal, not even a single idea. And it's really baffling that they say these things until you begin to understand that it's not about actually raising a serious grievance or addressing any kind of adequate concern. It is just about trying to make demons and devils out of people without ever actually meaning it. It's just to construct a persona about the committee, about the community, and so disunity and discord into our community. And so it's not even about defending better than general society, right? Lofty claim, representation of queer individuals. And so this queer individual shows up to say that that's actually completely at odds with the experience that they had at TSS now. Because, again, you really talked about in 2018, I was there for that year. I was in trouble with Kevin, so white, straight, male experience in my life. In other words, one of the least cool, right? We go on to talk about other times when we have come from spaces. Of course, this is just some, when I first did my I was a volunteer. I was still technically a nobody. But this person who reached out here and did this outreach, this is just some nobody. Brian Jr. is the man maintainer for the Secret Friday, which is, an audio server for it's something that even I had, right? And I'm not an audio person at all, right? But even I had heard this. Even I had seen this, involved in this. We completely disregarded this person's working effort, right? So right? Explaining why the notions on this manual and basically made up statistics and made up stories that were coming out of the individuals on these manuals for this diversity discussion is wrong, and nobody replied. So we completely ignored somebody who tried to inform us of his lived experience. Of course, that was the first and last time that Brian King ever sent an email to these manuals. The threat continues on after that, with everybody, again, talking about matchbox boy cars and why women are interested, their stuff not showing up, and basically, the only way was to take a better interest in the science and show what the real work is, and all this kind of stuff. And what was hilarious about us essentially excluding and ignoring Brian is that we are in recent words about having an audio library in Boots, right? So we push away the people who would be wildly qualified to help us with that endeavor, to review those things. And rather than take any form of their concerns remotely seriously, we would instead rather make up statistics and then completely ignore people who try to tell us actual facts. And it's wild. It really doesn't matter how qualified you are. It really doesn't matter how hard you work. If they don't like what you're saying, they'll just completely ignore you and drop the ball. Like, nobody reached out to Brian after this. Like, nobody told, nobody did anything actionable with Brian. So of course he's probably not going to show up for the Friday episode or anywhere in higher echelon. Right? It doesn't matter how technical you are. Right? So this is a side brand. And they're non-binary individuals that are still up on this, right? They are streaming a full conference. They organize a full conference, right? Microsoft University of stuff. They organize an entire conference and giving, their talk in that conference, right? So they're talking about, middle class and pretty different dynamic framework, stuff that was so interesting and so cool that even the foremost expert on C++ reflection actually showed up to prophesy about this and their previous presentation. And I was reading this talk, and I was watching the chat while this was being streamed, and I cannot tell you the number of people massively preoccupied with asking, is this a boy or a girl? Dropping slurs, making completely inappropriate comments. And we're not trying to just present our technical work, but for some reason, we can't even bring ourselves to pay proper attention or listen to anything they have to say about the subject. We're too busy, talking about their hair and the earrings and everything else, and asking, what's in their pants. So it doesn't really matter how technical you are, how focused you are. They actually, with me, they don't care. Right? No matter how many times they talk about the restrictions of meritocracy and trust fund it and get on their soapbox, change their clothes, come back, and then get an impromptu lightning pop in those new clothes in order to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that their conduct would be enforced equally. And in fact, that Latina did feel the consequences of their conduct. So we have individuals that believe in a strategic meritocracy that keep on spending their time proving that reverse racism doesn't exist, that will literally go full mask off and start and just dump out racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, you name it, that's what happened. Not knowing that they were playing checkers as pawns. Even with 2 days to prepare, the little 40 check that is going on in this woman's head in the span of 30 seconds. And it doesn't really end, right? Threads, comments, people who are too focused on the way you look when you're streaming an entirely free content filled with wonderful technical data that they can easily absorb and focus on. So rather don't spend time asking you if you're boy or girl, rather than just appreciating the fact that you look fire that day. It is a never-ending struggle, a never-ending battle. So, I've established beyond a shadow of a doubt that we have a problem in our community, that we don't focus on technology, that this is not a strict equal meritocracy. So where do we go from here? Well, the first start is this video, right? I made a promise to my friend that, you know what, I'll do hard work. Right? They say that education is good, alright, so do your education. Right? I provided statistics, I provided examples, I gathered everything I could possibly get to demonstrate that the community has a problem. A demonstrable, practical issue, not only in the community, but the community leaders. The people who claim they represent all of us. You know that current spaces are not an option because they are demonstrably unsafe. Because you have to be prepared to defend yourself. Because you must be prepared for unprofessional behavior. And in light of that unprofessional behavior, in light of that breach of the social contract, in light of that breach of the rules that even they themselves try to impose on me and other people, the hypocrisy that is ranked in these communities, yes, it is okay to make X content, or group, or internship. It's okay to have a predominantly black content. It's okay to have an older women's content. It's okay to focus on other groups of people. In order for us to have professional growth, in order for us to be able to contribute on the merits of technology, and not be harassed and judged by the color of our skin, the way we wear our hair, or the way we were born. Things that we can't control, that this community punishes us for. And of course, the goal isn't to kick back. The goal isn't to start a fight. The goal is because current spaces seem to be incapable of handling the responsibility of our safety. For whatever their reason. That's something for the conference organizers to figure out. But as people in this community who are facing the brunt of not because we're not the default white male, because we're not rich, because we have varying economic background, varying skin color, varying orientation, varying gender, and we need some way to help ourselves leadership is not only not interested, but actively contributed to the pain, to the hurt. This is not your problem. Alright? This is a single truth. And yes, 100% of the people speaking are black. And you would think that that is a good time to try reverse racism. But if you don't open your eyes and step back and look at the forest, if you don't focus and apply and think, why is it that a conference that existed for 2 years, can have better representation and provide a better outlet than conferences that exist for 2 decades? You know, I don't really believe in 10x developer, but in 1/10 of the time, Blackness Tech have done more for representation than every single other conference combined. The tree is not the problem. The one good tree and one of the bad trees is not the problem here. Pay attention to the forest. Ask yourself why the right-hand side is the way it is. And, if I can help you out, no, it's not reverse something. It's not reverse racism. It's not reverse sexism. Nobody's bashing straight people. We are not setting up power structures that make straight people, that make cis people, that make men, that make white people fail. Despite the vast structures that you have constructed that do make sure black people fail, that do make them feel unwelcome, that show beyond any reasonable doubt, statistically, qualitatively, quantitatively, that you have failed in your mission, in achieving your strict equal meritocracy. So until the time that the spaces that you write down and say are welcoming of everyone are in fact, are de facto safe. You, listening, right now, have a right to make a place where your person will be respected, your dignity not so detestably violated, where the people who claim themselves as community leaders are just using that title to masquerade around as abusive. And until then, until such a time as that truth happens, until such a time people stop assuming that black people exhibit low IQ behavior, that they're only good with their hands, until they stop being supplied, that black people can actually get things done. I would do